Thomas and an unfamiliar woman walked into the hospital room, both grinning. Thomas had no idea that I had assets valued at $6 million. He had to understand that for a housewife like myself, getting a divorce in my current situation might be fatal. Fine, here are the divorce papers. I collected the documents I always carried with me and handed them to Thomas. He smiled and took them. I can now say goodbye to you. Don't worry, I'll find pleasure somewhere else. Thomas smirked at me, putting his arm around Emily. As they exited the room, he added, "Take care, Miss, be careful, ma'am." Their euphoria was short-lived as they giggled, walking out of the hospital. Alone in the room, I started laughing. The divorce will be finalized by Monday, and since today is Friday, I eagerly await the next 3 days. Hello everyone, my name is Nancy, and I am a housewife from a typical farm family. I don't have any particular talents, but I'm proud of how well I can cook. Thomas, my husband, and I were roommates in college. We relocated to New York from the countryside and lived alone. During that period, I thrilled Thomas with a variety of rice and vegetable meals that my family had provided. I knew full well that I had won his heart through his stomach, as they used to say. Thomas has always relied on me for domestic tasks, ever since we first started dating. We loved our life together and bonded over our shared love of food, even though we were childless. During Thomas's days off, we would frequently take quick trips to enjoy delectable meals. However, after nearly 3 years of marriage, Thomas's behavior changed. He went from being kind to being dominating. He never hurt me physically, but his remarks became harsher, and he frequently questioned our financial status. As a full-time housewife, I felt useless, so I didn't have the energy to confront him, despite how hurtful his comments were. After graduating from college, Thomas worked for a renowned corporation, but his repeated job changes left him insecure about his finances. Despite this, he has been at his present job for 2 years, and I was hopeful for stability. One day, Thomas came home earlier than usual with unexpected news. "I'm home. I've quit my job," he said nonchalantly. Startled, I gasped, unable to hide my surprise. Thomas's eyebrows shot up in annoyance, and I panicked, rushing over to him. "I apologize. I was just surprised," I stammered. That day, Thomas seemed unusually grumpy, and I was afraid that any mistake I made would only make things worse. "You've grown quite bold," he shot back. I instantly apologized again, sensing his discomfort and trying to ease it. Thankfully, my apologies managed to calm him down a little. I silently placed a glass and a beer on the table as Thomas sat on the couch and turned on the TV. "Would you prefer a bath or dinner?" I asked quietly, aware of his dietary and drinking preferences. I played the part of the subservient wife, far from the strong-willed person I used to be, just to avoid upsetting him any further. Thomas filled up on food and drink, then fell asleep on the sofa, letting out a loud snore. The table looked like the aftermath of a child's messy dinner. I swept up the stray food crumbs and broken beer bottles off the floor. This was hardly the marital life I had imagined in my youth. As I looked at Thomas, I was glad that he was still asleep, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside me. Beneath the relief, though, was an increasing fear of continuing to live this way. Thoughts of divorce began to creep into my mind, and I mentally prepared myself for the challenges that awaited me. The next day, I resolved to face the problems I had been avoiding for so long. Thomas started going to the employment center, and he quickly found another job. While he was looking for work, I wasn't ready to file for divorce, but I went to the city office and signed the divorce paperwork anyway. I buried the signed documents at the bottom of my purse, where I kept them as a form of protection. I had no idea how Thomas would react if he ever found them. "Hey, where have you disappeared to during my job search?" Thomas asked one day, arriving home before me. I quickly answered, pointing to the resumes I had purchased. "I went to the stationery store to buy some resumes." That day, Thomas seemed especially serious. He appeared skeptical at first, but after accepting the resumes, he said he was heading out for drinks with his friends. His current job at a renowned corporation offered greater perks and steady pay, and I thought this would be his last job until he retired. Within 3 years, he was promoted and seemed content. He started attending social functions with his sales department more frequently for work-related reasons. I treasured these free periods, using the time to recharge. One day, after a lengthy period of silence, my mother called me unexpectedly after Thomas had left. Her passionate tale surprised me. $8 million. Yes, $8 million. You know those territories we owned, those mountains? According to the appraisal, they're worth $8 million. Perhaps it's time for you to reevaluate your life as well. After all, we only need $1 million to live comfortably for the rest of our days. Thomas had never been my mother's favorite. She was worried about me, especially because he had been exerting more and more control over me, and even forbade me from going back to my old home. I was astounded by the amount she mentioned, and even more surprised to learn that my mother had changed the ownership of the property to my name to avoid paying inheritance taxes. She ended the call with, "The final decision is yours, but it's probably best not to tell Thomas." I considered my options, torn between wanting to tell Thomas about the inheritance right away and keeping it a secret so I could be free with the money. About a week later, I was involved in a car accident. Fortunately, I didn't suffer any major injuries, but I was hospitalized for a week. As I lay in the hospital bed, I took my valuables out of the drawer and decided to give Thomas a call. I started by saying, "I'm sorry, I've been injured," thinking he would understand. Instead, his primary concern was his food. "What about my meals?" he asked, brushing off my injury. I hesitated to bring up the inheritance, so I simply told him I would be in the hospital for a while and asked if he could make arrangements for his meals until I got out. "Are you not even cooking your husband's meals?" "What a slothful woman," Thomas laughed, cutting the conversation short. That evening, I planned to tell him about the inheritance, but as I saw all the tubes attached to me during a test, I changed my mind. When Thomas walked into the hospital room, he grinned at me. "You're incompetent. You can't even clean the house. Let's file for divorce, and you'd better pay me back," he said icily. Next to Thomas stood a woman I didn't recognize, along with a few soldiers. Thomas had no idea that I had $8 million in assets. He should have realized that a divorce under these circumstances would drastically change my life. Calmly, I handed him the divorce papers I had kept almost like a charm and said, "Fine. Here are the papers." Thomas accepted them with a gloating grin. "I can finally say goodbye to you. I'll be content with her," he added, putting his arm around Emily, the woman leaning against him. "Madam, please take care," they laughed as they exited the room. "Oh, you're not a madam anymore, so take care, old lady," Emily teased. Their happiness wouldn't last, though. Alone in the hospital room, I laughed aloud. The divorce paperwork wouldn't be processed until Monday, and since it was Friday, I eagerly awaited the next 3 days. The weekend passed quietly, without any communication from Thomas, as I had expected. I felt restless since I hadn't been idle for years, and the nurses kept telling me to stay calm when I grew anxious. On Monday night, Thomas began calling me repeatedly. At first, I ignored the calls, but after they continued nonstop for 30 minutes, I finally gave in and answered. "Would you please quit being so stubborn?" I said. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas yelled the moment I picked up. He grew even more enraged when I laughed, and he began shouting louder. "What are you doing? Why aren't the divorce papers being processed?" He huffed and puffed, furious on the other end of the line. I laughed a little more and said, "Oh, I had already filed a non-acceptance notification. Do you recall how, every time we clashed, you used to threaten to get a divorce during one of our arguments? I figured it wouldn't be ideal if you suddenly decided to file for divorce. I don't need it right now. Withdraw it immediately, Thomas demanded, barely pausing before giving another command. However, I was no longer going to follow his every word. I have to be discharged before I can do that, I replied. We have to follow the procedures at the municipal office, he said. Then discharge now. I laughed even more at his self-centered demands. He had brought Emily with him on Friday, and it seemed likely that he intended to officially register their marriage. By the way, did she go by Emily? Isn't she your mistress? I inquired. It's impolite to Emily. Apologize to her. I have her as my new wife, Thomas yelled. She's technically your mistress since we haven't divorced yet. I responded coolly to Thomas's absurd comments. He groaned, clearly frustrated. I decided to strike Thomas where it hurt the most. By the way, my lawyer will be contacting you regarding the property division. That covers everything, so you'd better share wisely, I remarked. Thomas misunderstood and seemed unexpectedly happy. Ultimately, the liable party must provide recompense, he muttered. I had never cheated on him, and I had always done my housework diligently. It was obvious that Thomas was the one at fault. What don't you understand? I made it clear that you're the one who needs to provide me with the assets, I said. Thomas sounded sincere in his confusion. He probably thought I would be at fault, simply because I couldn't take care of him while I was in the hospital. Such reasoning wouldn't have held up even in my parents' time. What fault are you referring to? I gently clarified. Just so you know, being unable to do housework due to my hospitalization doesn't make me at fault. You've stopped looking after me, he insisted. It would be called child neglect if I were a child, but because I'm an adult, I'm supposed to take care of myself. That doesn't make you not at fault. If I say you're at fault, then you are at fault, Thomas argued, defying all common sense. My perception of myself suffered greatly. Did he really think such naive logic would succeed in taking me for granted? Do you understand now? Do you not know what constitutes a valid excuse under the law? For example, being at fault would include adultery, having a second woman while still married. It doesn't apply because Emily is my new wife and you are no longer useful to me. What are you talking about? It's obviously cheating if you were seeing her behind my back, I remarked. Thomas remained adamant, still not grasping the reality of his situation. In any case, going forward, please contact me through legal counsel. Goodbye, I said. Hey, Nancy. Thomas objected as I hung up the phone. He called me more than once after that, but I didn't answer. He finally appeared to give up and went quiet. Although I was relieved, another headache awaited me the next day. At 9 o'clock in the morning, my phone started buzzing nonstop, which was incredibly annoying. When I finally replied, Thomas's criticisms hit me like machine gun fire. After a while, I managed to piece together what he was saying and realized he was upset because he couldn't withdraw money from a bank account. Had it been a joint account, Thomas should have had no trouble making a withdrawal. I questioned him, were you trying to withdraw money from my account by any chance? I recalled the bank cards and passbooks I had left at home. Indeed, I was going to take the money since you're still in the hospital, but the card isn't working. Thomas yelled, his reasoning utterly nonsensical. It seemed he hadn't grasped what I had said the day before. Before being hospitalized, I had called the bank to ask them to temporarily freeze withdrawals until I was well enough to manage things myself. This was to prevent my finances from completely draining due to Thomas's carelessness with money. My decision turned out to be correct, although it's unimaginable to attempt to take money from your ex-wife's account after a divorce. Thomas, however, saw nothing wrong with it and insisted I transfer the money immediately. What are you saying? We no longer really know each other. Why would I follow your advice? I answered. Even though we're divorcing, the reality that you remain in my life hasn't changed, Thomas emphasized. Act like a proper wife and listen to me. Even though we haven't formally divorced yet, we already don't get along, I remarked regretfully. I don't have money to give to strangers." I had never fought him so much before, which startled Thomas, but he soon regained his assertiveness. "Just follow my instructions. Transfer the funds immediately. Reimburse the person who handled housekeeping." Even though Thomas had once been intelligent, he seemed to have lost all common sense. After 17 years of marriage, it was clear I had chosen a bad partner. Thomas seemed frustrated that I refused to give in, likely because he had run out of funds after taking money from our joint account and the living costs I had left behind at home. I addressed Thomas as though he were a child. "Listen, I'm not your little wife anymore. We'll use a lawyer to resolve the property distribution." "What? You're quite conceited. I'm on my way over now. Just wait," Thomas replied, then hung up. I didn't object to him visiting the hospital, but it was doubtful he would reach my room, since I had already instructed the nurses' station to allow only my parents inside. When Thomas arrived at the hospital, he was met with the usual halt at the nurses' station. My phone continued ringing, and when I didn't answer for a while, it switched to messages, flooding my screen with alerts. I called my lawyer and kept all of the messages as proof. Eventually, the flood of messages stopped, and it seemed that my lawyer had spoken with Thomas. Just when I thought this ordeal might be over, my hopes were about to be crushed. "Sandra is one of the guests. Would you like to visit her?" inquired the nurse. "Sandra?" I asked, surprised. "Yes, please let her in." When I was single, I had a friend named Sandra who shared my interests. We became close after she responded to my posts on a social networking site where I documented my dining experiences. We soon discovered we lived nearby and frequently went out to eat together. After I got married, I had to cut back on eating out to save money, but Sandra and I still met often for tea and conversations, which helped us stay in touch. "Nancy, are you okay from the injury?" Sandra asked as soon as she walked into the room. I could feel her compassion, and it warmed my heart. I realized that, aside from my parents and the medical staff, no one had shown me such concern since I was admitted to the hospital. "Hey Nancy, things are tough for you right now, aren't they?" Sandra asked. "What? Why?" I replied, puzzled. Only my parents knew about my predicament, so I was curious how Sandra had found out. "Are you familiar with Emily, the little girl? Isn't she having an affair with your husband?" Sandra remarked, startling me. "How do you know about that?" "Do you know her?" I asked. Sandra hesitated before replying. "Actually, she's my niece." I was so shocked that I couldn't hide it. Who would have guessed that Sandra was Emily's aunt? The room fell silent for the first time since Sandra had arrived, and the quiet made me uneasy. "You know," Sandra continued, "Emily suddenly announced to my sister, her mother, that she was getting married. What's even more astonishing is that her fiancé is 45 years old. When I saw the picture, I recognized your husband. I was stunned. I told my sister everything." "Sandra, I really apologize for the inconvenience my niece has caused you," she said, her voice filled with regret. "Sandra, don't apologize," I told her, noticing that she looked like she was on the verge of tears. "It's not your fault. I'm considering asking Emily for compensation. I'm not going to let this go. But does this mean our friendship will end?" "Of course not, Nancy. I want to be friends with you forever. I'll make sure Emily pays for what she's done. My sister and I can't forgive her actions, and we'll be keeping a close eye on her," Sandra reassured me. Her words meant a lot to me. Our friendship spanned more than 20 years, and I didn't want my horrible husband and his mistress to destroy that bond. "I've scheduled a meeting with those two tomorrow, and I'd appreciate it if you could come with me," Sandra said. "Of course, I'll be there, and I may bring photos as evidence of their affair," I replied. After being released from the hospital the next day, my lawyer and I went to a private dining area where Thomas and Emily were already seated, enjoying a lavish traditional lunch. I couldn't believe their audacity. "At last, you succeeded." "Did you bring the cash?" Thomas asked, barely pausing to eat. "Remember, you're paying for this meal." Beside him, Emily continued eating, her expression smug. I decided to reply calmly. Please take care of the payment on your own. Furthermore, I'm here to insist that the two of you divide your possessions fairly. For how long will you pout? Thomas scoffed. You're truly not appealing. Ignoring his rude words, my attorney and I sat down and presented evidence of Thomas's negligence. We began by showing legal documents that outlined his obligations, followed by papers related to the distribution of property. Finally, we revealed the photos Sandra had sent, pictures of Emily and Thomas together, along with images of Emily entering a hotel with an unidentified man. Hold on, what? Emily, what is this? Thomas stammered, visibly unsettled. Emily, too, stopped eating, her smugness fading. Sandra arrived at the perfect moment. Those are my photos, she stated firmly. What? Sandra? Emily looked confused, not understanding why her aunt was there. Sandra calmly explained, I've been friends with Nancy for 20 years, then pointed out how disgusting Emily and Thomas's actions were. Her eyes were cold as she continued. And Emily, you mentioned that the baby you're expecting is his, but given your behavior, who knows who the father is? Wait, no, Emily stammered. Her appearance today gave no indication of pregnancy, and this was the first I had heard of it. But Thomas's reaction implied she had indeed claimed to be pregnant. You're expecting? I asked, raising an eyebrow. If that's the case, I'll be seeking additional punishment after a DNA test. No, I apologize about the pregnancy, I lied. Please forgive me, Emily suddenly confessed, her posture shrinking. She had been relying on Thomas as her meal ticket, seeking out older, wealthy men. He had promised her a carefree life after marriage, showering her with luxury items. She thought she could be a housewife while continuing her affairs. When Thomas didn't seem eager to get a divorce, she had even lied about being pregnant. Now, Thomas was left astounded by her deceit. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do for you. I'm short on cash, Emily admitted. Sandra took control, telling Emily that until she paid me back in full, she would need to work diligently, taking on part-time jobs each month to repay me. As Sandra escorted Emily out of the restaurant, Emily looked thoroughly defeated. Sandra promised she would see her later for another apology. Thomas, who had been in disbelief the entire time, finally regained his senses and approached me with a pleading look. Well, it seems I was duped, Nancy. I can't survive without you. The divorce papers are still here. Can we start over? You've always been a housewife. You couldn't possibly work now, could you? I stared coldly at him, completely unmoved by his words. I smiled and replied, I can live just fine without you. After a pause, I continued, I will be submitting the divorce papers shortly. And, by the way, I never mentioned this before, but I currently have a net worth of about $8 million, which allows me to live comfortably for the rest of my life without working. $8 million? Why did you conceal such a large amount of wealth? Thomas questioned, shocked. You started raising a fuss about a divorce just as I was ready to inform you. Moreover, since this money is an inheritance from my family, it isn't part of our marital assets. It's unrelated to you, I retorted. Thomas gave me a hopeless expression. My attorney promptly came over with some paperwork and a pen for Thomas to sign. After our departure, we filed for divorce immediately, ending our nearly 2-decade marriage. Subsequently, Emily transferred the money into my account. Sandra told me that when her mother found out about the situation, she became furious. She ordered Emily to take a leave of absence from college and work nonstop at an inn owned by a relative until the debt was repaid. As for Thomas, his in-laws rejected him the moment they heard about the divorce. Reluctantly, he took out a loan and repaid me in full. It was also discovered that he had spent work hours in a hotel with Emily. After losing his job, he started working multiple construction jobs to pay off his obligations. As for me, I wasn't sure what to do with such a large sum of money, so I donated half of it to charity. With the remaining funds, I moved to the countryside and now enjoy a lavish single life. Sandra and I have remained friends, and on our days off, we take short vacations and go on food tours. I suggested that since neither of us plans to remarry, we should live together. After some hesitation, Sandra agreed, especially when I proposed that we could split the deliveries and she could join me for dinners. As we prepare to move in together next week, I feel excited.